As Yannis said, I'm Tomislav Stojanov. I'm an affiliate at the Institute of Croatian Language and Linguistics. Hello from Zagreb, Croatia. And my presentation plan is that in the next minutes, I'll say something about my research. And in order to try to answer the core question of my talk, I'll give you a historical overview on sociolinguistics of punctuation in 4 epochs: in antiquity, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, humanism, and the Enlightenment, which will bring me to the present state. As some of you might already know, Croatian is one of the European languages with a long written tradition in 3 scripts: Glagolitic, Cyrillic, and Latin, and a long tradition of cultivation of orthographic norms. I've been preoccupied with orthography, punctuation, graphemes, glyphs, etc., for more than 10 years. My PhD in 2015 had focused on orthography and language policies in Croatian, so I did some counting. I took into consideration only de facto or de jure official and standard orthographic manuals in Slovene, Serbian, and Croatian. Of course, I have to point out that not all of them encompassed substantial spelling changes compared to a previous edition. I just wanted to compare the situation in 3 close South Slavonic languages. There have been 3 different orthographic manuals written by Levec, Breznik, and Slovene Academy in 7 printed editions in Slovene. 2 manuals, Belic and the Matica Srpska, in 13 editions. However, take a look, an interesting case with Croatian. There have been 13 different manuals: Broz, Boranic, Cipra, Gubernia Krstić, Klaić and others, Cipra, Klaić and others, etc., in 52 printed editions, excluding reprints and illegal imprint editions. So you can see there is something on with Croatian. I can give you more interesting sociolinguistic facts. Since the 1990s and the Croatian political independence, there were 5 attempts to pass legislation on Croatian orthography with 4 parallel orthographic standards since 2000, 3 of which have officially been supported for public use. 8 years ago, I participated with 13 other authors in the creation of the latest Croatian orthographic manual, which was officially supported for use in primary and secondary schools in Croatia in 2013. As an active participant in these events, it might not surprise you my passion towards punctuation and sociolinguistics. This is just a glimpse into a bigger story of the Croatian orthographic norms and related ideological standpoints, which is the topic of my 2-year postdoc at the University of Nottingham as a European Commission's Marie Curie Fellow. My project proposal is named Spellflict, Understanding Spelling Conflicts, a case study of new standard language in the former Yugoslavia in the European context. More information can be found behind these 2 links. So, the first thing I would like to say is to pose a question. Can we talk about a sociolinguistics of punctuation? And if yes, what would that be? Well, in order to tackle these questions, I will dive into an overview of the development of historical punctuation to see how has punctuation evolved and which social or socio-political, technological circumstances or criteria were important during this long process. In order to determine the state of punctuation in a certain historical age, I decided not to use text corpora, as this would be an overwhelming endeavor if one wants to create a picture for Western Latin languages. Instead, I will be looking up into grammar books. Why grammar books? Well, from ancient times, grammar books were the language manuals that played a central role in the history of writing. Grammar, logic, and rhetoric were the trivium of liberal arts, the essential part in a classical education in antiquity and the Middle Ages. Looking into old grammar books has numerous interesting aspects, as already stated by many scholars. Insight into the culture, the history of education, and an evolution of linguistic thought, observing the development of literacy, etc., etc. So I was looking into punctuation description in old grammar books that were available to me. I've tried to find the first editions, and I've tried to include the most relevant, important grammar books. Here are some numbers: 3 grammars from antiquity, 2 from the Middle Ages, 40 grammars from the Renaissance humanism, out of which there were 21 Latin and 19 vernacular ones, and 12 from the Enlightenment. In the antiquity, there were 3 basic punctuation marks: periodos, colon, and comma. As you can see, English imported these exact terms. They all look the same. It was a dot, but the difference was the position depending to the position of a line, to the top of a line, to the bottom, and in the middle of a line. As you can see on this picture in one ancient manuscript that I took over from Wikipedia. Imagine yourself as an orator standing in front of the public in some ancient agora, and you need to persuade people in some important matter. Since rhetoric was a very esteemed skill, you were trying to do your best in the public speaking. You could have learned the text by heart, or you could have peeked into the parchment in your hands. If you've done the latter, you couldn't have recognized words, could you? So some witty orators inserted dots, which actually meant here you can stop and breathe in, or here you make a significant stop. According to Aristotle, to punctuate someone's text was quite a challenge, and I definitely agree. In the Middle Ages, Latin was no longer a native language. However, a need for knowing Latin was still very present. What you did, you were using old Latin grammar books written many times in monasteries in centuries before. If you truly wanted to understand what the Holy Bible says, you had to learn Latin from these native speakers and to contemplate its very essence from the ancient interpreters. Since the Holy Scripture was a very important book, grammar books were actually interpretation of a language that was used in the Bible. This is why grammar books of the Middle Ages didn't introduce any significant novelties when it comes to punctuation. Comma, colon, and period were insignificant as characters. They were just graphical symbols for more important syntactic units. So some translators even translated the terms of periodos, comma, and colon as sentence, clause, and phrase. The following era of the Renaissance humanism brought the great invention of the printing press, which affected punctuation greatly. Printed text needed new characters to facilitate the reading. Thus, it is no surprise that we can thank to one of the first printers, Aldo Manuzio or Aldus Pius Manutius, for further development of punctuation. He knew that printed text had needed to be adjusted for easier reading, so he invented, for instance, today's comma, a dot with a small tail, italics, and semicolon. Since the grammar was an art of interpretation of all texts, it is no surprise that he also wrote a Latin grammar in 1493, by the way, without an orthographic chapter. However, his grandson, with the same name and surname, published the book Orthographia Ratio in 1561, which is definitely his grandfather's work. Namely, he was only 14 then. He couldn't have written such a work in his age. So punctuation was no longer in the syntactic chapters, but at the beginning or at the end of a grammar book, or within the orthographic chapter, or in the orthography annexes. This means punctuation became to be considered as an independent content from the grammatical teaching. The Renaissance humanism is also well known for the emergence of first vernacular grammar books. People started to travel, to trade, they needed to learn foreign languages. I took into account the first 19 vernacular grammar books of the European languages, having in mind their first editions, religious background, and a grammar book meta-language. Namely, I wanted to see if there were any connections between these things. Well, I believe there is a link between grammar books and the religious background, which I will discuss furthermore in my paper. Namely, these so-called Catholic grammar books served our role to support evangelization and re-evangelization. In these grammar books, punctuation and the written language was of secondary importance. Now, however, Protestantism relied on printing and spreading the written word. This is why these vernacular grammars gave more importance to punctuation than the Catholic ones. Neither of three Catholic grammar books didn't have any punctuation description. Actually, there is one, the first German grammar book, but the author wrote it during his Protestant period of work, so he transmitted it into the Catholic order. It is interesting to spot that none of 9 secular grammar books contain punctuation as well. 4 of 6 Protestant grammar books contain punctuation description. I plan to further investigate why the first Polish and Finnish grammar book didn't contain punctuation description. These grammar books introduced new punctuation, hyphen, semicolon, brackets, exclamation mark, question mark. And we can see that spreading of books stimulated reading and the invention of more sophisticated written marks. The Enlightenment is the period when many things substantially changed in people's lives. We had compulsory primary education, the spread of language academies and language purism, the invention of normative language, etc. Grammar books were commissioned to be written by authoritative people, and they were the very first normative language manuals. What you have today in many countries with language norms and language academies that take care of language purity is actually the heritage of the Enlightenment. I can even say that standard orthographic manuals I've seen so far are very similar to the orthographic manuals issued during the Enlightenment period. For instance, in case of Croatian and other Slavonic languages, manuals written by Adelung and Felbiger. The great majority, 9 of 12 grammar books of this period, contained the description of punctuation. The grammarians were innovative, and we had many new punctuation added, such as quotation marks, square brackets, various dashes, etc. Punctuation was described more pedagogically, more structured, clearer, with shorter rules. Moreover, orthography was getting separate from grammatical teaching, which means the written characters and punctuation were finally differentiated from speech. Now we're coming to the modern times. If you ever use modern technologies such as Discord, Slack, Twitter, massive multiplayer online role-playing games, you will see many special characters with new meaning. These are actually new punctuation. These are new graphical ways to insert meaning into the text. I see no difference between an exclamation mark, a classical punctuation mark that means I emphasize this, and some emoticon, for instance, a smiley. If ancient philosophers had been focused on humor in their tractates, they would have invented some sort of a dot representing smile. They didn't have any use of smile in their text of those times, but we need these. We need to express more and more subtle feelings. And the ability to express these feelings in a right manner represents a new written language literacy. As a Croatian language practitioner, my role was to describe formal punctuation usage and create some normative rules. But during this work, I've encountered many sociolinguistic facts that had needed to be taken into consideration while deliberating on punctuation norms. For instance, when I was discussing the keyboard writing and typing, shall we mention Unicode in the orthographic manual? Why we need to describe more punctuation because of the increased level of the written language literacy today? To one of the most well-known Croatian linguists, I was simply answered, keyboard is not an issue of our concern. Our goal is to preserve a tradition. Another example, there is a certain hyphenation rule in Croatian and some other Slavonic languages, which I oppose strongly. I find this rule obsolete and a silly one, to be honest, in which you have to insert a second hyphen insert a second hyphen at the beginning of the new line when a compound word written with a hyphen reach the end of a line. For instance, this word hrvatsko-bošnjački written with a hyphen. When it comes to the end of the line, you need to insert the second hyphen at the beginning of the new line. This is a picture, and this hyphenation example shows you clearly on the typographical nature of this rule. But this rule is obsolete today. You cannot insert it in Microsoft Word. There is no need to have it afterwards. So the reason for keeping this rule standardized for the last 30 years, when more texts are being produced on our keyboards than in printed books, is a sociolinguistic one. Now we come to the conclusion. What can we infer about our language by observing the evolution of punctuation? Well, in 4 historical periods that influenced grammar books substantially: antiquity, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance humanism, and the Enlightenment, I've shown that punctuation served the grammar book function. In antiquity, punctuation marks were respiratory marks for the purpose of language rhetoric. In the Middle Ages, punctuation marks were syntactic units for the purpose of language hermeneutics. In the Renaissance humanism, punctuation marks were typographical and written units for the purpose of language learning. In the Enlightenment, punctuation marks were normative units for the purpose of language prescription. What is today? How are punctuation marks described today? What is the purpose of writing? Or better asked, what is the level of the written language literacy today? can we achieve the desired level of literacy by looking up into normative orthographic manuals? These are all open questions. I'm not giving you any ex cathedra answers. But what I believe is that the evolution of punctuation is strongly technologically and sociolinguistically featured. If we were to follow the historical development of punctuation, as we saw in the 4 major punctuation eras, I assume we will have some sort of style manuals for the contemporary written language literacy, in which we would explain the usage, the technology, and the style of all punctuation marks that we are surrounded today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Any questions from the audience?
I see the chat. We should add a Unicode code points into the manuals. Oh, Portuguese official orthography also has a rule about the double hyphen. Thank you for this information.
In Polish also there is a double hyphen for words which already have a hyphen. So when you hyphenate, you put a second one on the beginning of the line. Mm-hmm. I have a question by Mark Kuster.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I see it. If the emoticons...
How would you see the use of emojis in general?
Well, I believe Unicode already partially answered this question. There are more and more emojis, emoticons. They are added at the end of the sentence. Sometimes they are replaced. Classical punctuation, such as dot and the comma, they're replaced by emoticons. Well, Unicode has divided emoticons into its own group. I can't remember now how many punctuation marks there are in Unicode, but there are dozens of them. And they're not as fixed group as that has been think of before. There are new punctuation marks. I believe I will, in my paper, I'll describe this relationship between Unicode emoticons and punctuation in more detail.
I have a question by Pere Farando.
Yes, please, I'm here.
Mm-hmm.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Well, I would like to know whether you have tried to just establish, to list some basic punctuation practices as prescriptive, so as to leave all the others to manuals of style. For instance, just in orthography, it's just stating after full stop, uppercase, so I mean, is not there clear division between prescriptive and stylistic?
Mm-hmm. Well, I haven't found many stylistic manuals that describe punctuation. You can find them for English, for instance. You can find some functional style manuals, for instance, in a famous book that people from libraries are using when they have to look up into some specific detail how to handle writing of bibliographic references. I'm sure these kind of manuals are demanded, are required, very, very needed today. They would not be, of course, normative rules. They have to describe the usage. You have to know where to find what kind of punctuation in a specific text mean, and how to insert it in your keyboard, as a matter of fact. So, Pere, thank you for your question. I hope this answers you.
Okay, thank you.
And I have a remark by Sveva. Thanks, Tomislav. Could it be that the different use of punctuation depends on the kind of texts in all these periods considered? Even if in antiquity we can see differences in use, just think about Latin comedies.
I would like to know more about these different functional styles in these eras. I focused on grammar books because they have strict discourse, strict writing style. So I was able to compare this line of evolution of this functional text in grammar books. I'm looking forward actually to contact you, to give me more references about it. I'd like to mention it in my paper.
Okay, there are no other questions. So thank you very much for this very informative talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.